He was trying to show it was business as usual. In the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin began the day meeting Russian Olympic champions. Like them, he hates losing. With the Olympians, Putin was up close and personal. Not so with his next guest. The UN Secretary-General had come to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The seating plan said everything about the gap between Moscow and the international community.
You're
telling me that Russia's humanitarian corridors in Ukraine are not functioning. Mr. Secretary-General, you've been deceived. The corridors are open. We've helped more than 100,000 people leave Mariupol.
And from the UN, a plea to Russia for peace.
It is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond.
The Kremlin agreed in principle to UN and Red Cross involvement in evacuations from Mariupol. But Moscow isn't rushing to halt its offensive. For diplomacy to succeed, there needs to be the political will for peace. But right now, there's little sign of that in the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin seems determined to continue the offensive he launched in Ukraine, at least until he can secure what he can present to the Russian people as a victory. That means no ceasefire in Ukraine. The Russian military continues to attack and continues to deny that Russian troops have committed war crimes. Kremlin critics argue that considering the scale of destruction, the UN chief should have travelled to Ukraine first before flying to Moscow.
I'm not in a position to give any advices to the General Secretary of the United Nations, but I would probably go to Mariupol first. I would go to Bucha. I would go to Irpin. I would go to all these places, talk to people, and then fly back to Moscow and meet with Putin and say, Mr. President, what you're doing is crime.
Russia claims to be acting in self-defense. But it was President Putin who ordered his troops to attack Ukraine. The Kremlin started this. It's determined to end it on its terms.
Well, that was Steve's report. And let's join him now live in Moscow, our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg. Steve, you observed that session today, President Putin and Antonio Guterres. What did you make of President Putin's own demeanour, if you like, and what have we learnt about the latest thinking in Moscow?
Yeah, well, first of all, what have we learnt about Vladimir Putin? That nothing has changed. There is no sign that the Kremlin leader is ready for peace. He continues to try to justify his actions, justify his so-called special military operation. And seating the UN Secretary-General at that enormous table, that was a real statement, I think. I mean, this was not a host who was saying, welcome to Moscow, let's have a cosy chat. The second thing is, there is growing tension, we see it, between Russia and the West. Today, Moscow accused Britain of trying to provoke Ukraine into attacking targets on Russian territory. And one of Mr. Putin's closest allies, Nikolai Patrushev, who heads the powerful Security Council, Russian Security Council, he claimed that the actions of Western governments and the Ukrainian government would lead to the breakup of Ukraine into several states. That sounds like a warning or even a threat. So basically what we're seeing from Moscow is not de-escalation, it's escalation. And another example of that, from tomorrow, Russia is stopping gas supplies to Bulgaria and to Poland. So as well as this military conflict now, it seems that we're going to have an energy war too.
Steve, many thanks again. Steve Rosenberg, our Russia editor, with the latest there in Moscow. Let's have more on today's exchanges, because the US Secretary of Defence says that he wants Russia to be less able to bully its neighbours. Lloyd Austin was speaking in Germany at a meeting of more than 40 nations about the conflict in Ukraine. Mr. Austin committed to supporting Ukraine's resistance against Russia's invasion for the long haul, in his words, and pledged to move heaven and earth to make sure that Ukraine was ultimately victorious. Paul Adams, our diplomatic correspondent, is with me. What have we learned from these exchanges today, Paul?
Well, Hugh, I think this was the largest single expression of support for practical support for Ukraine that we've seen so far. More than 40 countries answering that call from Lloyd Austin that you just referred to move heaven and earth to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs. A really calculated display of international solidarity, as some countries are moving towards supplying much heavier, more sophisticated equipment. He talked about and praised the UK, Germany and Canada, who have all pledged armoured vehicles in the last day or so. Now, Sergei Lavrov, as we've heard, calls this a proxy war. Clearly, it isn't. Ukraine is fighting for itself, not for anyone else. But the West's support for Ukraine, military and rhetorical, is now more emphatic, more bullish than ever. And Lloyd Austin says Ukraine can win, and everyone here in the room agrees. He's obviously trying to tie everyone into making sure that that happens. But just to give you an idea of sort of where that rhetoric is taking us, you heard Steve referring to this threat from Moscow. Well, this was triggered by James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, this morning, who said that he wouldn't mind if British weapons were used by Ukraine to attack targets in Russia. The Russian response was a rather specific threat. It said they reserved the right to launch targeted missile strikes at facilities in Kiev, even if Western advisors were present. That's a pretty specific and ominous warning. And I think it gives you some idea of the extremely delicate and explosive territory that we're now in, as Steve has already suggested.
Paul, many thanks once again. Paul Adams there.